Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Okay, wonderful. It looks like we have quite a few people joining, so we'll go ahead and start the webinar. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today to discuss the impact of domestic violence on mental health. So please introduce yourself, as many of you are doing in the chat, with your name, position, organizational affiliation. And I know some people are joining us from outside of Minnesota, so feel free to include what state you're from. So just so you are all aware, we will be recording this webinar and we are going live on our YouTube channel as well. So if you have any coworkers who weren't able to get into the webinar because we've reached capacity, tell them to search for Women's Advocates on YouTube and it will let them know that we are live and they can watch the webinar at the same time. So I'm going ahead and pressing record and we are officially live. So hello, my name is Brennison Wheeler. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Advocates.
My name is Saran Cryer. I'm the mental health therapist at Women's Advocates. Good morning, all.
We also have Quincy and Aaron joining us today to provide ASL interpretation, and we are so grateful that they are here with us today. So we would like to begin the webinar by asking everyone to take a collective breath together. You can use this graphic on the screen as a guide, just to tune into the present moment, the space that you are in now. We also want to remind everyone that domestic violence can be difficult to learn about and discuss, so do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Many people experience domestic violence, so some of you may be differently impacted by this content or recognize some of these behavior in your own life or in the life of someone you know. Throughout the webinar, there will be a couple of prompts to promote engagement with the audience through the chat function. Our first one is the following: write in the chat one word to describe how you're feeling right now. Seeing calm, stressed, confident, anxious, ready. Sorry, give us just a moment. We are making sure that our ASL interpreters are viewable. Discombobulated, that is a very, I'm sure many people have felt that throughout the past few months. My apologies, everyone. We want to make sure that we can see. My apologies, everyone. We're having a little bit of difficulties with viewing the other panelists. Thank you so much for bearing with us. It should only be a few more seconds, minutes, hopefully. We're trying to just make sure it's accessible for everyone. You're getting a large opportunity to take many deep breaths here. So give us a little bit of time to really ground ourselves and be centered. Okay. Okay, so it looks like we're gonna try to do a separate Zoom for our audience that will meet with Aaron and Quincy. In the meantime, we're going to chug along. Please let me know if you can't see myself or Saran in the chat. Okay, we're gonna move on. Thank you for sending in your words and for your patience. I really, really appreciate it. So when you all registered for the webinar, you would have seen this list of objectives, the topics that we will be covering today. Saran and I really want this to be a relevant, helpful, and practical as possible. And we encourage you all to engage with us. So it's really a discussion rather than us just talking at you. For those of you who aren't familiar with the webinar feature in Zoom, we cannot see or hear any of the webinar attendees. Instead, you can use the chat box right above the text where the type 2 in the chat. Make sure the button is changed to sending it to all attendees and panelists so everyone can see your message. You can also use the Q&A or question and answer feature to ask specific questions that we can directly answer in the chat. We also wanted to remind everyone that a PDF of the slides and the recording will be emailed to you after the presentation is complete, so you can explore the resources that we link to the slides at a later time. So let's officially get into it. So how many of us have heard of Women's Advocates before registering for this webinar? So I'm going to launch a poll. So it looks like it's about almost half and half. I'll give it a few more seconds for people to submit their answers. Wow, so I'm seeing 56% say no, they didn't know that Women's Advocates was the first domestic violence shelter in the nation, and 44% are saying yes, they did know that. So I'm going to end the poll. Here are the results. So we'll keep this section really brief since the focus is on mental health, but we did want to mention the organization that we're from, which is indeed the first domestic violence shelter in the nation. Over the last 45 years, we've learned so much about domestic violence. We have expanded our physical space into 3 Victorian homes, which are all interconnected and located in St. Paul, Minnesota, where our mission is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. We provide prevention and education services, provide shelter to 50 women and children every day with various advocacy and support programs, and a housing program to help survivors find and maintain safe, sustainable, affordable housing for them and their children. If you'd like to learn more about Women's Advocates, you can head over to our YouTube channel to watch our mini video documentary series with Twin Cities PBS, which honors our 45-year legacy. Now that you know a little bit about us, we'd love to know more about you all. So here's a poll question asking about your professional position. This will help us gear some of the content specifically to your work. So I'm going to launch it. So we know the content of this webinar probably attracts a lot of different folks of different professions and positions, because we know that domestic violence impacts so many different people. Birth doula, awesome. So 43% so far are domestic violence advocates. 30% are social service providers. We have art therapist, attorney, general crime advocates, an academic. Hi, Jessica Hodge. Family housing advocate, prosecutor's office, paralegal, early childhood specialist, site director, mental health associate. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for telling us a little bit more about you and your position. I'm going to end the poll, share the results in case you're curious. And now Saran will tell you a little bit more about the mental health services that she provides at Women's Advocates.
Okay, thank you. Women entering shelter have experienced tremendous physical, emotional, and sexual abuse that has affected their overall mental health. The trauma focus and strength-based therapy at Women's Advocates helps to restore integrity, rebuild self-esteem, and rediscover one's resilience. For instance, A young mother, 28 years old, with two children, ages 2 and 9 months, just entered shelter. The children are crying, they're irritable, and mom tries her best to comfort the children and expresses how frustrating she feels and overwhelmed. Her advocate explains while she's in support groups, her children can spend time in the children's program where they are able to engage in a variety of activities and just spend time to be children. Then mom enters the mindfulness group and learns how to relax her body through breathing exercises. She learns how to pay attention to her senses and body sensations. She's able to ground herself and center her body and feel her breath. She learns how to be present in the moment because all she wants right now is just to relax, just to be, just to feel her breath. Mm. There's other things that we participate in with the mental health services, and it's helping women to understand psychoeducation. And that is basically women who come in with the diagnosis would talk about that they're not very familiar with their diagnosis. They understand symptoms, but really the actual diagnosis. So we work through explaining and talking and discussing their treatment plan and how to support them in their treatment plan and in any basic understanding about their diagnosis. Okay. Okay. Thank you. That'll be, look at the next slide here.
Yes. So our next slide here is we would like to know more about what your current understanding is of domestic violence. So feel free to write your responses to any of these questions in the chat box. Having an understanding of what your beliefs are is helpful because it shows up in how you support survivors. We hope that by the end of this webinar, your responses to at least some of these questions will be expanded. So what do you think of when you hear the term domestic violence? Do you think of a certain kind of person, a certain relationship dynamic, maybe a certain kind of violence comes to mind? What words do you use to describe someone that experiences or causes harm? Where have you seen it? Maybe if you are a domestic violence advocate, you've seen it firsthand or have heard stories recounted firsthand. Maybe you've seen it in the media shows or personally in your own life. And why do you think that domestic violence happens? So you can add any of these into the chat now. Power and control comes to mind, intergenerational trauma, cyclical power imbalance. Absolutely. Unacceptable, unwanted behavior by one party to another, humiliation, learned abusive behavior and conditioning of normalizing abuse, physical, mental, and emotional violence. Great, thank you so much for sharing. You can continue to share your thoughts as they come up. We'll move on to the next slide. So for those of you who particularly maybe thought of women as survivors of domestic violence, this is a particularly powerful visual that starts to scratch the surface of how widespread this public health crisis, domestic violence, is. So the numbers are similar around the world, but specifically in Minnesota, we could fill the target field 17 times with just the women in Minnesota who have experienced domestic and or sexual violence. I know whenever I'm in a large sports stadium, I wonder how so many people can fit into one space. And it's really powerful to think about the chances of you most likely have encountered or worked with or studied with or even been friends with or a family member of someone who has experienced domestic violence without you even knowing it. While numbers and statistics are important in understanding the scope of the issue, these are real people that we are talking about. They're not just numbers or stats, they're whole entire people with hobbies, interests, passions, quirks, personalities. They're people like Raven. Raven Bianca Gant was 27 when she was shot and killed by her boyfriend, Randall Watkins. Every year for 30 years, Violence Free Minnesota has released a Minnesota domestic violence homicide report. This story is from the report only a few months ago. You'll see that in reading this specific excerpt about her death, there are different themes that we'll be discussing in this webinar threaded within it. There are mentions of people trying to intervene, history of violence, information about the intergenerational cycle of domestic violence, the impact on housing stability. Domestic violence impacts all facets of someone's life, and today we'll particularly focus on how it impacts mental health. We will revisit components of Raven's story a few times throughout this webinar. So for those of you who are curious about more recent statistics, here are some statistics for Minnesota specifically, and then we'll talk broadly about the US. So one statistic that I do want to bring to your attention is the one about how less than 50% of people who experience domestic violence ever reach out for services, which reaching out for services is also how many of these numbers are underreported. So this means that all of you and your unique professions, so medical providers, mental health providers, advocates, you all have a unique opportunity to reach out and provide support and connect survivors to resources. Another statistic that you might be more familiar with is that 1 in 3 women have experienced a form of physical violence by an intimate partner. So that doesn't even account for other forms of violence that are extremely detrimental that we'll discuss later. We also want to note that 1 in 4 men have reported experienced physical violence as well. Some people are surprised to learn that, since many initiatives are focused on survivors who identify as female, like our organization, due to the disproportionate rate and how the violence is gender-based, and power dynamics, as many of you have mentioned, are compounded due to gender roles, norms, and expectations, and how they're manifested in different systems of oppression. So we do want to acknowledge and honor that anyone of any gender can and does experience domestic violence. However, we may use pronouns she and hers to describe the victims, since our direct and personal experience has been with female survivors. So moving on to a quick definition, there are a lot of different terms for domestic violence. There's relationship violence, intimate partner violence, family violence, child abuse. We wanted to include this definition so we're all on the same page about what we mean when we say domestic violence, which isn't necessarily the legal definition that would qualify for a protective order. This definition helps us really understand the scope and different tactics that are used in an abusive relationship and what the goal is, which is almost always to gain power and control over another person. The component that really makes domestic violence different from violence from a stranger is that close, intimate relationship. The fact that this violence and pain is being caused by someone who claims that they love and care about you, whether it's a former partner, current spouse, a parent, a grandparent, uncle, aunt, or even roommate, someone you live with. That adds a layer of complexity, and they hold a unique power to hurt someone in a way that a stranger maybe never could. So we'll discuss this more later. So I mentioned earlier that domestic violence is a public health issue, but it isn't experienced in the exact same way by everyone. People who hold certain social identities may experience domestic violence at higher rates than others. So, for example, it might be helpful for you to know that American Indian and Alaska Native women experience domestic violence at the highest rate among mono or single ethnic identity individuals, particularly if you work with a specific population. Disproportionate rates don't just occur among racial and ethnic identities. Women with disabilities experience domestic violence at an alarming rate. Same with bisexual women, undocumented women, bisexual men. It's really important to know this because it might challenge some of your previously held beliefs about who can and does experience domestic violence. We want you all to have a full comprehensive picture so someone doesn't fall through the cracks because they didn't match what your idea of a victim is. I once gave a presentation to a dental clinic, and one of the dentists told me about a patient they had who they described as a handsome, charming, wealthy man who seemed very strong and confident. The dentist proceeded to tell me that this man revealed that he had been experiencing domestic violence, and the dentist was shocked. They consulted with other providers at the clinic who had a really hard time believing that this could really be happening. I share this to say that anyone truly can experience domestic violence. However, the way that they experience it can be different depending on the social identities that they hold. Typically, an abuser will use tactics that they know are most effective, and often are the ones that target a specific social identity are extremely effective and painful, like an abuser threatening to report an undocumented survivor to ICE if they try to leave their relationship. You're welcome to write in the chat examples of how an abuser might use someone's social identity to tailor their threats and harms. So I'll pause here just for a moment to give people a chance if they would like to contribute maybe different stories or different things that they have heard or people that they have worked with in which their social identity was weaponized or used as a way to create harm. Using social media, yeah, posting defamatory things about the victim on social media. Exposing them at church. Yeah, maybe that community that you had at church, they won't provide as much support. In an LGBTQ relationship, the abuser might threaten to out the victim. So if they're not out, yep, threatening to out. Absolutely. I worked with a large football player, male, who's afraid to disclose abuse because the partner said that she would get him kicked off the team and school. Deportation, refusing to sponsor getting a visa when the survivor left. Absolutely. Judgment from family. Yes, those are all definitely different ways. Continue to add them in the chat. I'll read some more out, but we'll move on to the power and control wheel. Oh.
Okay, so how many of you are familiar with the power and control wheel?
So we will add the poll. You can raise your hand as well, but I'm going to add the poll too so we can see everyone.
Maybe you have seen the diagram or you have heard about it, have used it with your clients. Anyone?
So it looks like here I'll end the polling so we can share the results.
Oh, okay, there it goes. None. Okay. Okay. Well, the power and control wheel is a tool that helps explains the different ways an abusive partner uses power and control to manipulate a relationship. The power and control wheel originated in Duluth by Ellen Pence in the 70s when women's advocates was gaining momentum. I want you to think of the power and control wheel as a dance. Okay, so, and then the manipulation tactics, those are the words between the lines as the lyrics to the dance. And the abuser taking the lead to the dance to control the victim. Okay. Now, I want you to keep in mind that the dance is brutal and tormented. It appears that every couple develops a dance that is deeply rooted emotionally, mentally, and physically, shaping intimate partner relationships. Some couples have pleasant, graceful lyrics where their dance is driven in equality. And then there are those whose dance is driven by the destructive lyrics, as shown in the power and control wheel. At any time, the abuser could use any of these tactics: emotional abuse, even using economic abuse. And what happens, they could go around the wheel, and any way that they feel that they could manipulate the victim survivor, they just continue the dance. It goes around and around and around, and it doesn't stop. So anytime you see this wheel, try to think of it more as a dance, not a happy dance, but a dance. A few chats here I see. Okay, okay. You see those, Brenison? I think there's more chats going on about the wheel. Okay.
We do use the gender neutral wheel in practice. However, sometimes for contextualizing it with how much we've learned historically over the past couple of decades, that is sometimes why we use the original wheel. Thank you. So we have learned a lot more about the dynamics and forms of violence since the 70s when the power and control wheel was created. This slide here about the different forms of violence is really interesting. So the response that I get from the attendees really depends on where I'm giving the presentation. I was actually kind of surprised when many high school students could name more forms of violence off the top of their head than some adults and social service providers that I've presented to. So many students describe almost every single one of these forms, even if they don't have a specific name for it. So all of these forms have a way of impacting someone's mental health. A teen who engages in sexual intercourse for the first time, whose partner refuses to wear a condom or removes it without the other person's knowledge or consent, can be a violation of trust that can cause distress and worry and anxiety. Someone who may use religious texts to justify their abusive actions can cause a victim survivor to question their belief system or trigger a spiritual crisis, in which many survivors turn to their belief systems for support and for hope. Some teens describe hating their phone or always needing it on them because they have been conditioned by their abuser that if they don't respond to their texts or calls fast enough, there will be negative consequences, which can cause hyperarousal, anxiety while doing any daily task that isn't communicating with their abuser. One of these forms of violence might be more evident to you depending on your specific profession. So if you're a doctor, you might be more privy to any physical indicators of abuse. If you're a housing advocate, you might be more inclined to notice more financial abuse. So expanding your toolbox is helpful because some of these other forms that might not be as apparent to you may be experienced by the person that you're trying to help. So all of these different forms can impact someone's mental health, but what if the form of violence is weaponizing the survivor's mental health?
Women have shared their feelings of shame and humiliation from demeaning words and comments used against them because of their mental health. Lately, a person has shared how her intimate partner stated that if they ever had a child custody case, he would be the one who would get the children because of her mental health, and that the other things that happens in the household, she gets tired, she forgets things. Now, even though it's not true, the person still believes that something is wrong with her because of her mental health, and it could hurt in a court case. So there's so many things that's used. There's just awful things that are used. And gaslighting, if you look at gaslighting, it's one of the resources that you could look at. Gaslighting really puts the pin on the needle. It talks about how the abuser uses denying that the victim survivor really understands what he's talking about, denies it by saying there's something wrong with you. It's because it's your mental health, you can't figure out things. It's so many bashing things that's used against. So it's an awful thing that happens. Women have been called crazy because they see a therapist, and things like, I don't want my children to grow up like you because you're nuts, and just different types of things that is very offensive, painful, hurting. But for sure, when you have time, look at the resources for gaslighting. It talks a lot about the different ways that are used so often to weaponize a person's mental health. And I think we lost our sound. Can't hear.
Oh, here we are. Simone asked, what could make a person so cruel to want so much power and control to abuse people? So we actually do have a slide. We're going to get to that in the next one. So bear with us, but thank you. We're going to get to that. Thank you for pointing that out. So similar to the power and control wheel and the different forms of violence, you may have heard of these 8 different warning signs of abuse, but just like the other tools, we wanted to add a mental health lens to it. So these are different these are different behaviors that abusers engage in to get what they want, which is typically power and control. So I once sat in on a abuser intervention transformation program in Duluth, Minnesota, the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project. They have a male and female program. I sat in on the male abuser group. So anytime someone in Duluth is charged for a domestic assault, they're required to complete this 6-month program. So these men are all sitting in a circle with the facilitators at the front, and the facilitator begins the session by asking the question, what do you do when you don't get what you want? And many of the men proceeded to describe different behaviors. They'll say they'll get really angry and throw things, or slap that individual, or hide that person's keys so they can't go to work, call them names, insult them, say that they're a bad partner or maybe a bad mom, say that they're stupid, or prevent them from being able to see their friends or family. Tell them that what they're doing is their fault and it wouldn't happen if they just did what they told her or what they wanted her to do. So my question to you is, how do you think living in this environment, and which this is how conflict is addressed, impacts a survivor? So maybe it causes fear, anxiety, sadness, loneliness. After I observed the session, we all debriefed, and someone asked, what would cause someone to act that way? What causes someone to choose to be violent? So we do have a comment about language barriers, how the abuser is often the person who explains the situation and can make the person look like they have mental health issues. So absolutely, we definitely see that as well, of that social identity being weaponized. And also that they're kind of creating, it goes back to gaslighting, of creating and distorting the reality because they might have power, in the sense that they might have English as maybe a stronger suit for them. So using that as a way to manipulate the victim into thinking that maybe they do have mental health concerns that they really don't. Um, the clients that I've talked about domestic violence have rooted from generations and generations. So yeah, the norm, the normalization, the generational effects, absolutely. Thank you for adding that in. So getting back to Simone's question about the causes. So a decent amount of research has been conducted on exactly this, what causes it. We know that domestic violence is a choice and it is a learned behavior. So for those reasons, it can be difficult to say that domestic violence is caused by any one single factor, but there are common beliefs and attitudes that abusers hold that may result in them choosing to use violence, and where they learn to believe those things can be from family growing up, the media, shows, songs, movies that they watched and listened to. Maybe their peers may condone it. Maybe the culture they're surrounded with may promote or accept it. So over time, these people have learned that maybe this is the way that you get the things that you want. There are a ton of other theories that you can learn more about at the source that I linked at the bottom left. But we do want to note that no survivor causes their own abuse. And while there may be a link between maybe alcohol, drugs, and stress, none of those things cause someone to be violent. So plenty of people drink and do drugs, and they don't all choose to be abusive. So that's just a little note about that. But if you want to learn about more of the theories, go to this source. I'll link it in the chat as well. Most abusers come from abusive families and they want to hurt because they hurt. Yes, there are some people that have the phrase of, hurt people. And that definitely attributes to the cycle of violence as well. Okay, I added that link. So you might be wondering how mental health and domestic violence are connected if it isn't a cause.
Being that domestic violence impacts the entire person, it also impacts their mental health. If you are a mental health provider, you may have noticed that some clients diagnosed with PTSD, depression, or anxiety have also experienced abuse by an intimate partner. Now, if you are a domestic violence advocate, you may have noticed that some clients that you work with display symptoms of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. You will find that in your work, these two issues are often linked. An example could be a young woman who just got into a domestic violent relationship, but prior to that, she was doing very well. She was going to school, she was working, taking care of her child, everything was fine. And she meets someone who now is verbally and physically abusive to her. She develops this extreme emotional distress. So it pretty much interrupted what her mental health at that point. And in doing so, what happens when I meet with women who experience mental health issues with a domestic violence partner or intimate partner is the question is always, how did this happen? What did I do? What's going on with me? And it really isn't. It was a disruption in her life, but it was a mental health concern. So she was distressed and able to use techniques and skills to build herself back into continuing to work, child's in school, and just continuing her life as it was prior to, yet and still having those fears within in herself and nightmares and different things like that she may experience. But over time, those types of things will pretty much disperse after she works through her mental health. Now, there's a difference between mental health and mental illness. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more. So let's just say the person I was just talking about is Alice, and she was going through the experience of having a problem with the person. So it is important to note that while mental health and domestic violence are linked, there are different levels and ways that a victim survivor can be impacted. Every victim survivor is unique, and they are not all impacted in the same way. There is an important difference between mental health and mental illness, and someone with mental health diagnosis, if you have a mental health diagnosis. For example, person A, we will call her Alice. She experienced domestic violence and her mental health wellness has been impacted. She struggles with her usual daily functioning. Maybe she isn't feeling exactly like herself, or something just seems off. She has trouble concentrating at work or coping with any amount of stress, but she doesn't have a diagnosable mental illness. This story is common for many survivors, maybe feeling a bit nervous, especially after an abusive relationship, that something bad will happen, but it isn't severely impacting her ability to do things that need to be done. So she'll be able to continue to work and to continue to function. Now, another example will be Barbara, person B. Now, Barbara has a pre-existing diagnosis, let's say schizophrenia. And before she experienced domestic violence, after she experienced domestic violence, her symptoms got worse. It impacted her in a very severe way, to where she struggled to maintain her treatment plan, and or she might experience more extreme paranoia. So the difference is that a person who has pre-existing mental illness, their symptoms can exacerbate, and it could really overwhelm them to where they would need treatment and where their symptoms may become more extreme.
So I want you to continue to think about Alice and Barbara, particularly Alice. Many of you have probably seen the cycle of abuse before. There are debates about how helpful this model can be. One common misconception by people who haven't experienced domestic violence is that domestic violence is an isolated event. You'll hear landlords or police officers say there's a domestic incident or event, but it is not a one-time isolated event. It's a pattern of behavior that an abuser causes and a victim lives within. The cycle can be helpful in affirming that not every waking second is horrific and bad. There are good moments, as seen in maybe what's dubbed as the honeymoon phase, where maybe apologies and promises of change are made and hope is instilled. But maybe there's calm, where everything is seemingly okay, where survivors might say, I want to be with this person, the person that the abuser is when they aren't enraged. But as you think about the cycle, what people might see or know about on the outside, it's also important to know that this cycle often triggers another cycle that survivors experience, which can be understood as the cycle of anxiety. While all of this is going on, the survivor is learning the pattern. The tension can cause anxiety. The abuse can cause the survivor to seek refuge when the abuser goes to work or when the survivor goes to work. Maybe they use drugs or alcohol to escape the anxiety and pain. And during the honeymoon phase, there's a short-term relief from that anxiety where hope is maybe building. But the brain, after it has triggered that fight or flight, freeze, or even fawn response, it remembers the pattern and that anxiety never fully goes away. And then the cycle repeats itself again and again. So I want you to think about the lasting impact that that can have on someone living in this seemingly never-ending cycle of chaos and distress. I would like you all to write in the chat how in this process, what is the survivor learning? Maybe even think about how in your profession you can act to disrupt this cycle, or how knowing this cycle can better help you support the people that you work with. So, what is the survivor learning in this process? What is the abuser instilling? How can living in these cycles impact someone's mental health? So, Courtney said that they start to learn that abuse is love. Definitely, especially as we will talk about the intergenerational cycle a little bit more in the next few slides. But seeing that maybe as you're growing up, seeing that's how, maybe your dad treated your mom, and you said, oh, that's just a normal part of being in a relationship, or that's just a part of how you express love. So it definitely becomes normalized. This idea of it won't get better. So we know that that cycle, it used to be 7, but now it's up to 12 attempts of trying to successfully leave an abusive relationship before you officially can. Normalcy, they take on the blame, the shame, they feel like they deserve it. There's a feeling of hopelessness, absolutely. Internalizing the abuse and begin to believe that everything is their fault or something is wrong with them. Definitely. That never gets better, no matter what they say or do. Yeah, there's a lot. Trauma bonds. Yeah. The responsibility of keeping the peace. If I just hadn't done this, any type of abuse can create physiological symptoms such as cortisol, that stress hormone that can stimulate a feeling of addiction, feeling that the abuse is deserved, that one can control the abuser. Yeah, there's a lot of things that people learn during this. Thank you so much for adding your thoughts. We'll continue to discuss this in the next slide. So going back to that story about when I observed the abuse intervention and transformation program, after the facilitators asked the men, what do they do when they don't get their way? They responded with their different behaviors, and then the facilitators wrote down those behaviors on the board. Then they wrote another column next to it titled beliefs, and they asked the abusers, or the men in the room particularly, what beliefs fuel your actions? What are you thinking when you do those things? What makes you think that you can do those things? And many of them answer with things like, I'm the man of the house, or it's my way or the highway, or they can't do anything right. They referring to the person that they're causing harm to, or that they need to feel in control, or the man needs to be the breadwinner, or the man needs to command the household. So these beliefs fuel that cycle of abuse and what is happening. They also might be instilling harmful negative core beliefs in the victim survivor. So the survivor might start to believe that maybe they're weak, they're trapped, they're unlovable, they're worthless, they're undeserving of care. A lot of the things that you all mentioned in the last slide. So many survivors are directly told things like, no one is ever going to love you the way I do, by their abuser, or that no one else is going to want them. And while friends and families might not think that's the case, these negative core beliefs start to be ingrained in the survivor. They feel real. They feel true. So these core beliefs are embedded within the cycle of anxiety and abuse, and these core beliefs can contribute to the cycle of violence. The core beliefs that the abuser holds, they then carry those beliefs with them that fuel more abusive actions and behaviors when they're with someone new, which is what we saw in Raven's story. So the woman from the beginning of the webinar, her boyfriend had a history of assault charges with a former girlfriend that he had a child with. And these beliefs caused him to continue the violence in other relationships. And even when Raven's dad tried to intervene, he used violence against him as well. So this is how he knew how to handle conflict. Same thing for the survivor. They may still believe all of these things, even when they're in a new relationship that might be healthier. So many different therapeutic or intervention efforts target these core beliefs in both the survivor and abuser to start to change those beliefs, even if it's all that they've ever known. So that can be an essential step in breaking the cycle. Beyond the cycle, there's also this notion of a continuum.
And let's keep in mind the core beliefs in the continuum as we look at this chart. When we look at the chart, the intimate partner relationship can move from one continuum to the next, or it could just fluctuate between a couple of the continuums. Let's, for instance, insulting. A person, an abuser could assault a person by using condescending and patronizing tactics, and the feeling that the victim or survivor would get out of that is it to be very embarrassed and start feeling bad about their self-esteem. Now, what happens with the continuum, you can go all the way, it goes all the way to violence. But in some couples, depending on where they're at, they could go through the insulting, they could go through the controlling manipulation piece. And if they seek some type of therapy, some type of intervention to work through their situation, it could stop. But if they don't, it could get worse. Now, it's not as if a person's in an abusive relationship and they go from insulting 1 month and then the next month controlling and then isolation. It could happen. You could be in the insulting phase for a good while. And what happens is that the victim survivor starts looking at this is how we are, this is our dance, it's normal. It becomes a normalcy for what's going on. Oh, he yells at me when the food isn't cooked the way he wants it cooked. And then the core values come in for the abuser, to where it's really, I'm doing this to control your mind. So depending on where they are at in their relationship, they could seek counseling, therapy, any type of intervention to prevent from continuing the dance all the way to violence. Now, once we get to violence, as we know, is fatal. And it really is, when we look at it, it could be a homicide issue. I want to go to isolation. Some of you, just for your comments, if you think about isolation, if you ever had met a person, or maybe one of your clients has mentioned to you, well, he doesn't like me to be around my family because my family doesn't like him. And yet and still, I think he's just, overprotective of me. He's just jealous of me and want to keep me to himself. That happens a lot in isolation. And in isolation is to where, well, I could deal with this because he's showing that he wants me all to himself. But actually, the abuser is creating a false sense of security. So I don't know if any one of you have experienced it with a friend or with the client, have along this continuum, especially isolation. And what happens again in isolation, especially if it's family members, they would say probably to the victim survivor, this isn't right. We don't get to see you. This just doesn't make sense. This isn't how you are. And once the victim survivor receives some type of help or support, that could prevent her from going even further into the threatening and violence continuum. So the continuum is pretty much our dance. The continuum is, this is how we do the way that we do. When it gets really higher up, it gets really, really vital. So even for threatening, a person may feel, oh my goodness, this is not right, the things that's happening to me. And then they go through the phase of the flight, fight, and freeze. So looking at this, please look at it in a way it's to where it could move or it could stay in a phase during a good period of time. So I don't know if anyone has anything to chat about on that piece, but yeah, okay, that's fine. Go ahead. Oh, here's some. I can't really see them.
So there's a note that says, I've seen victims' ability to interpret stimuli change who were isolated by abuser, very dangerous form of control. Oh, so we have a question about a counseling piece. So how likely is an abuser to be willing to enter counseling, given they likely won't acknowledge their behavior as problematic? And how can one help couples avoid abusers weaponizing counseling?
I think as far some abusers will want to go to counseling, especially if the victim survivor is pretty much I am just through. We have to do something to keep our family together, and I can't go through this. There are some abusers who will seek counseling. How that would be in counseling, I don't know if they're really ready, if they're willing to change their behaviors. That's definitely a possibility. If it's to where it's just another tactic and it happens often to where an abuser will say, okay, we'll go to counseling. I'll go with you. Let's just deal with this. But and then not go. So it really depends on the situation. I understand that um, victims, survivors that I have met with often say, I think if myself and my intimate partner, if we could go to counseling, things will be better because being that I'm now in shelter, he wants to work things out. So it really depends. And it depends on where they are on the continuum.
Yeah, I added 3 different links to learn more about what the Domestic Violence National Hotline has talked about, how they particularly don't recommend couples counseling for abusive relationships. Um, yeah, so Lena's definitely getting in on this point of I think it's important to distinguish that an abuser should seek counseling therapy on their own for domestic violence, but couples specific therapy for abusive behavior project the idea that the victim's behavior is to blame. So definitely these different websites will kind of support that comment as well. So if you want to learn more about that, definitely visit those links that I added in the chat. But hopefully we answered your question. Okay, thank you. So, as Saran mentioned, the pinnacle of the continuum is violence, and oftentimes lethal violence. So, one of the most common questions that I get from people in the community is, why don't survivors just leave? If it's so horrible, humiliating, and scary, why do they choose to stay? And that's often a misconception. Many survivors don't really feel like they have a choice, right? They feel trapped, and the abuser does an effective job in threatening them or coercing them to believe that staying is better than leaving. Or maybe the survivor has tried to leave in the past and their situation got worse. So the ability for a survivor to successfully leave is not contingent on them or their strength. So the abuser plays a large role in that. We know that abusers can stalk their victims after they've left, threaten and harass them, use their personal information to take out loans and cause economic distress like coerced debt that they could spend the rest of their lives trying to pay off or recover from. We know from Raven's story that she had outside support. She was able to live with her parents and she made efforts to leave, but her abuser took all of her personal belongings and forced her to come back to his house, where he shot and killed her in front of her 2-year-old daughter. So maybe Raven knew that he was capable of doing that, and maybe she had tried to leave multiple times, but was really scared or felt like she couldn't. So if you want to write in the chat what reasons that you have encountered in your personal work that has prevented someone from being able to leave an abusive relationship, it can be something mentioned on the screen or something different. Dawn says that the abuser needs to own it. That's their issue, not the victim. Yes, definitely. And that's why there's I wouldn't say a lot, but there is work being done in specifically Duluth with the abuse transformation programs. I know Men as Peacemakers are doing a lot of work of having particularly men who are abusers, but abusers in general, to own their own actions and their decisions and try to break their thought patterns and try to replace those core beliefs with ones that are rooted in equality rather than power and control. So people are writing in threats of pets. Maybe they bought a house together and her job is as a PCA to the abuser's father in her home. Yeah, it's feeling a responsibility and not being able to leave. Shame is a really big one. It can take a lot of time, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this. Not many survivors will come to you and say, hey, I identify as a domestic violence survivor. Oftentimes it takes a long time to really internalize that and come to terms that someone who's supposed to care about you and love you is harming you. That can be really, really difficult to even acknowledge. Maybe having someone around is greater than the need to be safe. I know a lot of times we hear of the familiarity of, it might be really difficult, but I don't know what it's like to not be in the situation, or just the fear of the unknown can be something that is really challenging too. Threats of suicide, financial support, threats to report them to CPS, get their children taken away. Children are definitely often weaponized in this situation. The distrust with the police and other agencies from prior experiences, absolutely. The belief that maybe the abuser will get better with the right medications. Um, Claiming parental kidnapping if the survivor leaves with the children. That is unfortunately very common. Wanting to maintain a happy family image. Absolutely. We've heard from people that, I would be the first one to get a divorce in my family and I'd be ostracized. Being a single parent is hard. Yeah, not knowing how to do it without that extra support. Excuses of maybe he's only like that when he's drunk. Um, Maybe the victim survivor doesn't know a healthy relationship. Maybe they don't think that they're worth loving. They want the abuse to end, not the relationship. We hear that a lot of. I know that the person that I love is in there. If they just stop doing these certain things, it would be great. Maybe they don't have any other housing options, cultural pressures, absolutely. Religious beliefs, religious manipulation, absolutely. Thank you for sending those in. You all are very knowledgeable, so thank you for including that. We'll move on to the intergenerational cycle that we've mentioned before.
And the intergenerational cycle of violence, if you just look on the diagram, it just shows you it's a cycle and what happens. So I'm going to just give an example of Kevin. And Kevin is 5 years old and has been exposed to intimate partner violence. Kevin's father is physically and verbally abusive to his mother. The abuse worsens after Kevin's father drinks alcohol. When Kevin enters kindergarten, he displays anger and aggression towards his peers and throughout grade school. He is viewed as a bully in the classroom and on the bus. At age 13, Kevin tries to stop his father from beating his mother. His father pushes him and punches him in the face, calls him his outside of his name, and threatens to kill him if he ever tries to interfere again. Kevin walks away with a bloody mouth. During high school, Kevin uses alcohol and drugs and violence to intimidate his girlfriend. Then he approaches adulthood, marries, and has a son, Kevin Jr., who is also exposed to intimate partner violence between his mother and father. And he continues the cycle of intergenerational abuse. And that's how the cycle, it just continues to go until someone stops it, until there is a generation that stops the cycle from moving. When we look at the next slide, we're going to bring Kevin right in there. So I'm going to use Kevin for the ACEs experience. So the adverse childhood experiences, when we look at Kevin, if you would notice that Kevin experienced ACEs. And if you think about it, when we become adults, and if we think back, what has happened to us as children, what things have pondered our life or interfered in our sanity or our mental health. So when we look at Kevin, we look at he has been physically abused, verbally abused with threat, neglected, and he lived in the household environment, which was very hostile, and he witnessed abuse. So therefore, his ACEs, when he becomes an adult, really does impact his not only mental health, but medical health as well. So ACEs, we experience violence or some type of abuse. So working with your clients, can you think of any clients that have discussed with you, I'm sure quite a few, but that really stands out with their adverse childhood experiences? Do you see that there definitely is a link between that and mental health? Does anyone? Comments? Okay. Definitely. Okay, great. That's wonderful. Okay.
Okay. So moving on to lasting impact. So Saran just discussed how childhood experiences can impact someone in a lasting way. So as social service providers, professionals, you've probably observed how all of these different factors on the screen influence one another and how they can impact someone's mental health. So for Raven, had she survived the shooting, she would have had wounds to recover from, hospital bills to pay off. Survivors also frequently have stomach pains or issues with digestion, severe migraines. They may be prone to getting sick more often because their immune system is compromised from being in a constant state of fear and anxiety. Many survivors may have PTSD or flashbacks that impact their ability to concentrate at work, which could result in becoming unemployed or having difficulties maintaining a steady job, which could then in turn result in them not having the funds to pay rent, in which they could end up homeless, which is actually how women's advocates started to address that gap, that unmet need of having to decide between, am I homeless on the streets because I can't afford or access housing, or am I in a home that is abusive? So the isolation and control tactics from the abuser could cause strained relationships with family members or friends. So it can be difficult to reconnect and gain support. We know that experiencing these different hardships can take a toll on the mind and body. So compound that with pain and trauma caused by someone who can't claim to love you. It is a significant journey of healing and addressing all of these different aspects of one's life to feel whole again or to feel like themselves again. So luckily, we have people like you all who are attending who can help survivors do just that. And I did see a couple people raise their hands. If you could type your question or your comment in the chat, that would be the easiest way for us to see that. We do see a comment that an infant placed in an orphanage in Romania combined to a crib for her first 4 years of life, diagnosed with attachment disorder and anxiety and depression as an adult living in the US. Yeah, so seeing those adverse childhood, combined, yes. We definitely can see how those adverse childhood experiences can show up in other mental health concerns or challenges as an adult, especially if they're untreated or unaddressed. So if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the next slide about therapeutic techniques.
There are so many different types of therapeutic techniques to address trauma, and these are a few, and I'll just go over a few of them, and you will be able to download all of these. We'll start with the genogram. From some who are not familiar with it, it offers information, a good resource that offers information on how to use the genogram as a family assessment tool. It's very good information, really unique. The APEA guide is a great resource to explore. You will find screening, safety assessment, treatment options, and best practices in treating women who have experienced intimate partner violence. Let's see, discussing personal boundaries, discusses ways to talk about healthy and unhealthy relationships. So just feel free to download these resources. They're really great, good responses. When the experience of trauma is chronic, the brain continually responds as if it still is under stress by preparing the body for flight, fight, or freeze, even though the actual trauma event has ended. Because of this, it is important for those of us working with domestic violence victim survivors to use trauma trauma-informed approaches. I would like for you to just look at these 5 approaches to trauma and as support to work with clients. And I would like you to write in the chat, how do you promote these trauma-informed components in your therapeutic or advocacy work? Anyone, do you use any of these components? Safety, collaboration, choice, trustworthiness, empowerment as a way to support and to help trauma? Okay. Okay. I can't see those, Brenison. I see
Yeah,
some.
so there is some comments about power with versus power over decisions.
Okay.
So that definitely talks about, what does empowerment really mean? And how can you use collaboration to try to avoid power over? Client-led goals to increase autonomy. Yes, believing that the survivor is the expert of their experience. As a birth doula, I try to spend as much time with the birthing person before the birth as I can. This can build a relationship built on trust and familiarity. Using client strength. Talk to clients having a team of professionals to help them. So collaboration offers hope, and we suggest that they are driving the bus.
Perfect. That's wonderful. Thank you. It's wonderful.
Great. So this next slide, we also thought it was important to bring attention to your wellness. So for providers, caregivers, and advocates, it is essential that your wellness is a priority. You can't pour from an empty cup, so we gathered some helpful resources to help bring some practical self-care into your lives and hopefully mitigate burnout so you can continue to do what it is that you feel called to do, which for many of you is to make a difference in other people's lives. So we understand that during times like these, our own needs and desires have a way of being put on the back burner, but we are truly helping other people when we decide to help ourselves. So if there's any other wellness promotion, things that have been helping you during this time, feel free to share in the chat so other people can use that as well. I know people have used psychological first aid for themselves and in their own household, so if that's a useful tool, you can add that in. But we'll be sure to send these out to everyone so they have that too. There's another comment about, choice, person-centered, able to look at where I've been through to remember things that may not always appear like they are. It helps to stay patient and grounded in frustrating times. Help them to get financial stability by finding jobs, education, therapy, and utilize resources available to them. Yes, it's all connected. So all those things can help someone with their mental health. Yes. So we did also want to mention, so speaking of these unique and challenging times, we want to address COVID-19, how that can add a layer of complexity to this intersection of mental health and domestic violence. So many of the barriers and challenges that existed for domestic violence survivors before the pandemic have been exacerbated by these current conditions. So we know that times of uncertainty and fear of the virus can exacerbate existing anxiety, depression, PTSD, or other mental health concerns. On top of that, many people have limited access to in-person or telemental health support that they may have depended on to support their holistic well-being. We know that COVID-19 has given abusers another tool in their toolbox of abusive tactics to further manipulate, isolate, and control survivors. So related to the cycle of abuse, many survivors aren't able to get that reprieve or break that they normally would from being able to go to the store more regularly or go to school or work or the gym where their support system may be during this time in fear for their health. So let us know if you have any specific questions about the impact of COVID-19 on domestic violence survivors, but we wanted to add that in there because we know that that is something that is impacting everyone in different ways, but especially domestic violence survivors. So lastly, we wanted to end with some resources and how to utilize them. So these are some screenshots from our resource hub. So if you go to our website, and I'll add the link in the chat box as well, so you can take a look at those. We also have COVID-19 specific resources for DV survivors, so you can be sure to check that out. This just has some language about different ways to give resources and support for individuals. We have found that warm referrals work really well, so that would include saying something like, would it be safe for you to have a resource card, or would it be better for you to know how to access the information on your own? Because some people might get really excited and say, oh my gosh, a landlord might say, I want to get all these trifolds and put them under every single resident's door, but that's not always safe to do, right? So talking with them one-on-one is key, and asking if they can give them the information. So don't just slip different things in someone's bag or something like that, making sure that you're communicating with them, and also maybe even using names. So saying, oh, I know of Roxy over at Women's Advocates. She'd be happy to help you create a safety plan. Those things might be more comforting than saying, oh, call this 1-800 number or this line. So we do have information about tips on discussing mental health referrals for DV survivors. So I'll add that in the chat as well. Since many of you are domestic violence advocates, you might be thinking, oh, this person could really benefit from maybe seeing a mental health provider. So I will add that in the chat. And then this is our safety resource hub. So safety resources. So definitely check those out and let us know if you have any questions. But we have a lot of trifolds that you can download. You can print them out. They have they have all been researched, tailored to try to be the most beneficial and helpful. We have youth-specific handouts as well. And then we also have a comprehensive searchable sheet as well. So let us know if you have any additional questions. This is kind of our time for Q&A. We have about 7 minutes until we reach our time, but I will stick around, and so will Saran if you do have additional questions. But when you exit the webinar, you'll probably get an evaluation. This was our first webinar, so we appreciate all of your patience with this, and we appreciate any feedback that you can give us about the content, about the way we presented, maybe different tools or different things that you would use, or any questions or concerns or things that you think really worked and was really helpful. Feel free to add that into. That can really help us. We are doing this exact webinar again on Thursday, so we'll try to take your feedback in mind for that one as well. But we have our contact information on the screen, so feel free to email us any specific questions. Feel free to follow us on Instagram. We're very active on Instagram and Facebook, and we post a lot of resources and new things that we have found on there. You will receive an email with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides so you can access all of the resources. And as well as the evaluation form. If you don't have time to do it right after the webinar, you'll have the link to do that. And we will take some time with the recording. So if you need the recording, let us know. We'll get that out to you as soon as possible. So we do have a question. With COVID, this seems to have added another barrier for victims to feel safe leaving abusers. How are shelters ensuring safe distancing for victims? So I think maybe Saran, since you go into the shelter a little more often, you can speak a little bit more on that if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, we are definitely right now, quite naturally, the order has been lifted. But prior to that, we have practiced distancing, and we do that we have collaborated with other sister shelters, and some of our people are not located in our shelter. They are in community at another safe location. Everyone in shelter wear masks, gloves at times as well. So we have people who are they have enough room to where it's not crowded or overpopulated. So it worked very well. It very, very well. So that's what we're doing in shelter. And we're still, even though the order was lifted, we're still advising our clients to continue to wear their masks, practice social distancing in community, and just to stay safe.
So there was a question about continuing education credits. So we aren't officially affiliated with anyone right now. Typically, when we give presentations, it's for an organization that provides those CEUs. But if you are a social worker or something, you can let us know and we can send you a certificate of completion if it does qualify for those that you need. So hopefully that works out. Thank you all for attending and for being here, for showing up. We hope you all learned something that will be beneficial for your work.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Okay, so I will include a certificate of completion so people can know. Yes, I'll add that so you can fill it in with your name. So I'll add that to my list of things to do. Webinar attendance. Lots of good resources, wonderful. Thank you so much. Do we send you our email? I will send an email to everyone who has registered. So if you registered via Eventbrite or you registered via Zoom, you will receive the PowerPoint slides, the link to the recording, and a certificate of completion. If you're concerned that I don't have your email, my email is on the screen. I'll also send it here. And you can email me and I'll make sure that you get what you need. And thank you for those who have already sent in webinar feedback. That is super helpful for us. We'll be sure to look through all of that. So you can all feel free to exit. I'll stay on for maybe 5 more minutes and then I'll end everything. I'm going to check YouTube to make sure there's no last questions on the live chat here. Okay, no questions on the live chat on YouTube. I'm going to try to stop. We're all figuring out technology during this time.
Do you want me to log off or stay on?
Oh, no, you can stay on. I'll just stick around in case there's any last questions.